Hello, and welcome back to my podcast. Today, we're going to be covering the topic of grief and how to get through it. This is a very serious and somber topic, so I'm not going to bore you with any of my normal intro stuff. I'm just going to get straight to the point. Now, everyone experiences grief at some point, and we all experience grief in different ways. For some, it can be a lot harder to get through than it can be for other people. So today, I'm going to go and talk about some of the effects of grief, including the physiological effects and psychological effects, and how we can cope with them and understand them as part of the grieving process. Now, grief can hit some people extremely hard, especially if there's a sudden loss and it's very unexpected. There can be severe physiological effects, including the inability to breathe, panic attack-like symptoms like your heart beats too fast, your heart rate speeds up, or in some cases, heart rate that stops completely. Chest pains, you can feel like you're having a heart attack. These are actually not uncommon signs of grief, especially, as I said, if it's unexpected. When someone receives sudden life-altering news, they can actually get hormonal triggers, which tells their body that, something's severely wrong, and then they have a severe reaction. So some of those effects can be breathing, as I said, heart rate, chest pains, like I said, hormonal triggers, difficulty sleeping, immune system changes. You can actually be more prone to getting sick if you're grieving. You can feel like you're having a panic attack or an anxiety attack, and you may actually be having one of those things, and loss of appetite, among many, many other things. Now, I'm a person who's experienced a lot of grief in my life, and I can tell you that I've experienced quite a few of these symptoms myself, and it's really hard to kind of pinpoint or determine that you're going through these things while you're going through them, because your brain is just not rational and you're not thinking rationally. If you start having difficulty breathing, you don't stop and think, oh, you know what, this is grief and I'm having trouble breathing because I am grieving. No, you start panicking because you can't breathe, and that's normal. And these symptoms don't always present like right when you learned something horrible. They can come months after, or you could get them straight away and they could continue to come for months after. So later in this podcast, we're going to talk about ways to kind of manage these symptoms and cope with them so that you can continue living life, because life does go on. If you're grieving, life is still going to go on, even if sometimes you feel like it's not, or that you don't want it to. But before I get into that, I'm going to go through some of the psychological effects of grieving. I think it's really important to point out these things, especially for people who are grieving and they see other people around them who aren't grieving in the same way as them. They can feel isolated. It can feel like, that you're not normal because you're grieving in a different way. But grieving is a very individual act, and we all cope with grief in our own ways, and we all take our own time in the grieving process, and it is 100% a process. So some of the psychological effects of grief are depression, which is it doesn't need to be said really. Anxiety, and that can include physiological anxiety attacks. Lack of focus, so, you can't really concentrate on anything. I find that people especially have a hard time with schoolwork or actual work. You can have post-traumatic stress disorder from grief. Loneliness, and again, isolation, because you might feel like no one can relate to what you're going through. Emptiness, which is a big thing because people often numb themselves to severe pain, and that's kind of a normal reaction that our bodies do sometimes. Confusion, because It's hard to realign yourself if someone who you are really close to has passed. Anger and guilt. And those are two big ones because they're part of the 5 stages of grief, which we're going to be going over in a minute. So at some point, some doctors determine the 5 stages of grief, and you may experience some of them or you may experience none of them. Grieving is a very individual process, but this is the baseline for what people go through when they're grieving. And the first stage is denial and isolation, where a person doesn't want to accept what has happened, and isolation because they're kind of building a wall so that they don't have to accept what has happened. And when I'm talking about grief, I'm not only talking about people who have lost someone, because there are a lot of situations where it doesn't involve death of a loved one or death of a pet, where we experience grief in these ways. So yes, the first stage is denial, and the second stage is anger. And I have found, for at least me personally, anger is a very common stage of grief. And also with anger comes guilt, because you feel guilty for being angry at, for me personally, someone who has passed. I feel angry at them for kind of leaving me alone. I feel abandoned. And then I also feel guilty at the same time, because it's not like someone asked to die. It's not like they didn't want to be there. But these are feelings that you have, and it's not like right or wrong. It's just how you feel. And it can be upsetting, to feel angry at the situation, because you know that there's you don't have control over it. So it's normal to feel angry, and it's normal to feel guilty if you feel angry. And then we go to the third stage, which is bargaining. Personally, this isn't a stage that I go through, bargaining, because I feel like, and when you're grieving, usually it's about a situation that is pretty final. Though, to be honest, some people grieve for things like the loss of a job. Like maybe they loved their job a lot and then they lost their job, and that is putting them through grief. They're grieving over that loss. And that's a normal thing too. It's a normal thing to grieve over something like that, losing something that you loved dearly. So I think in that situation, bargaining would be kind of a stage that you might go through, where you try to bargain with yourself. You try to figure out a way to make this stop happening. But, then we move on to depression. Depression is the first step of accepting the grief, because if you're depressed, then you've kind of begun to see that you can't change the situation. And starting to kind of know that you can't change the situation is the first step in acceptance. And the final stage of grieving is acceptance. So the depression is kind of the beginning of that. So now you've heard the 5 stages of grief that are sort of a baseline for grieving. And obviously, like I said, not everybody goes through all 5 stages, and not all 5 stages are relevant to every situation, in my opinion. So, you can kind of tell where you're at. If you know that you're grieving and say that you're on the depression step, then you're nearly there working through your grief, supposedly. Because personally, for me, I find that if I'm grieving, it's not something that I ever get over. It's not something that I ever fully get past. I think that I learn to live with that loss. And I think that should be our goal when we're experiencing grief, not to get over it, not to get through it. We can find ways to manage it so that we can still function, and then we can learn to live with our grief. We make space within ourselves to live with it. Now, for a lot of people who are experiencing pain and grief and that kind of thing, it's easy to try to push it aside or ignore it, or just kind of put it out of your mind. You try to do that, because to feel it is painful. It hurts. And no one wants to willingly be hurt. But I'll tell you something, that's not a great way to handle bad feelings, because they will sneak up on you when you least expect it. So I really think that it's important to respect your grief, to respect how you feel, and to give yourself room. Give your grief the room that it needs to not fester, but kind of, for you to be able to accept it and work through it and understand it. If you are experiencing grief, you really need to be honest with yourself about how you're feeling, and you need to own those feelings and let yourself work through those feelings. Give yourself the time that you need for that, because they don't just go away. It's not going to just go away. It's not going to be something that you can ignore. It's going to be something that will sneak up on you. It will creep back when at the most inconvenient times. So you have to really give yourself that space. So now I'm going to get into the ways, after we've identified grief, how to kind of handle it. And these are the methods that have worked best for me. I did a lot of research on grief and how to get through it in my life. And these are what I found works best. I mean, there are a lot of suggestions and a lot of recommendations, and what works for me won't work for everybody. But I feel like if you kind of try some things, you will find what works for you. And this is what I found to be the best, because you can do it on a regular basis. It's not like you need anything extra, and you don't have to make special time for these kinds of things. And so the first thing that I use is breathing exercises. And it's not just when I feel like I'm having trouble breathing or something like that. I do breathing exercises whenever I feel myself becoming anxious, or becoming especially if I'm feeling depressed, or if I'm really thinking a lot about something that hurt me a lot, or something that brought me a lot of grief, whether it be the loss of a relationship, the loss of a loved one, the loss of something that was really important to me. So breathing exercises really help me when I can find my mind starting to race a bit and starting to think too much. So I just count my breath. I breathe in really slowly until I feel like my lungs are going to explode, and I count the seconds that it takes me to take that breath, and then I breathe out, and I count the seconds that it takes me to breathe out as well. And I also hold my breath for about 8 seconds, and then I do it again. So it would be breathe in, breathe out, hold your breath, and then start again. Because I feel like that really calms my mind down. I feel like just the simple focus on my breathing in and out, how it feels when my chest is expanding, how it feels to hold that much air in my lungs, how it feels to just hold my breath for a moment. It really calms my mind down. And I feel like it's going to be the same for a lot of people, because it's a physiological thing that you're doing, but you're making a big mental exercise of it. And then I also do other mental exercises, and that can be a lot of things. It can mean a lot of things for a lot of different people. For me, mental exercises is typically I will close my eyes and I will picture like a ball of light, what some people might call a wisp, like a blue ball of light. And I imagine that it's moving, it's just moving. And you have to really focus on doing that with your imagination. So in that way, it calms my mind down. And you can make the ball of light do anything that you want it to do. You can picture that it's covering you as like protecting you, or that it's covering you and calming you. You can picture that you're chasing it through the forest. You can picture that it's on a chalkboard and it's writing out letters in cursive, or whatever you can imagine in your mind, because I'm aware that not everybody has a super vivid imagination. So, I mean, those things are pretty basic, especially the chalkboard idea, for helping you to get your focus off something and onto something else. Because I feel like when we get frenzied, when our minds are going too quickly, we can't process anything because everything is coming too much at one time. And then also it starts to make physiological effects, like you might start having a panic attack or an anxiety attack. So in that way, these exercises can really help to slow you down so that you can deal with things and cope with things in an organized way. And these things really help, especially the breathing exercises, like if you're kind of at work or in a public space and you feel like you're getting overwhelmed because you don't want to have a full-on anxiety attack in public, and sometimes the panic of thinking that might be coming can make you panic more. So the whole point is to try to calm your mind down, because actually your mind is a very powerful tool and it's in control of everything. It's telling your body which hormones to release. It's telling your body if there's danger, which you might feel a spike of adrenaline, and adrenaline's going to make everything heightened and everything worse. So having a method that you can use even in public spaces to calm yourself down is really important if you are experiencing heavy grief. And another exercise that is really important to practice if you're grieving is forgiving yourself. Because a lot of times when we're experiencing grief, we actually blame ourselves. And if you, for example, if you have a loved one who passed away, then you might be blaming yourself or feeling guilty that you survived and they didn't. That's called survivor's guilt, and it's a real thing. And at that point, you need to be able to identify that that's how you're feeling, and you need to be able to start forgiving yourself for that. Maybe you're not grieving the loss of a loved one. Maybe you're grieving the loss of maybe like a relationship or, a job or something that was really important to you. And you feel like you could have done something differently or done something more, or you could have, if you performed better, then you wouldn't have lost the thing that you loved. And in that way, a lot of people start blaming themselves. They start feeling hatred towards themselves, but this is not a good thing to do. You have to forgive yourself because there's nothing that you can do to change it. You can't go back. You can only learn from it. So in this way, it's really important to forgive yourself. If you're feeling guilt for surviving, or if you're feeling guilt because you didn't do everything right. I mean, everybody is only human. We can only do so much. So you have to learn to forgive yourself for these kinds of things. And I know it's not so simple as it sounds. I know that it's really a process. But if you can identify that you're blaming yourself, then you can begin the process of forgiving yourself, accepting that you're human, and then learning to start forgiving yourself, which is a topic that I cover in another one of my episodes. So we've gone over identifying grief, ways of coping and managing grief, the stages of grief, and also learning to forgive yourself for grieving, and also respecting your grief and giving yourself time and space necessary to heal. So I think that that's all I'm going to cover on today's podcast, and thank you so much for listening. If you want to reach out to me, my social media links will be listed in the description of this podcast, and I hope to see you again next time. Thanks. Bye.